Hello and welcome to the third of our 5 Flock to Marion AGAIN seabird and marine mammal ID workshops. I am your host, Christina Hagen. Tonight we are focusing on the large birds, the albatrosses and petrels. Albatrosses seem to capture the imagination like no other seabirds. And although they are the largest seabirds, they can still be a bit tricky to identify and differentiate from each other. So Trevor's going to take us through all those salient points. And we had some amazing albatrosses on the last Flock to Marion voyage and really beautiful sightings. So hopefully that will be repeated come January. So for those who might not know Trevor, he's quite a well-known figure in the South African birding community. He started birding at a very young age and has been passionate, or some would say obsessive, his words, not mine, about it ever since. And he's birded extensively around Southern Africa, visiting all the countries that form part of the sub-region. He has spent over 600 days at sea in Southern African waters, with additional time also spent in the Southern Ocean and around the subantarctic islands and Antarctica, as well as all over the world in Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Peru, and the Caribbean. He is also the founder and operator of the SA Rare Bird News, an email alert system for letting people know about rarities and out-of-range birds throughout Southern Africa. And there's currently over 6,000 subscribers. So Trevor is very, very well qualified to be presenting this ID workshop. Trevor is the owner and operator of Zest for Birds, which is a pelagic trip operator working out of Hout Bay in the Cape Peninsula, and it's been going for 24 years and has taken well over 5,000 birders out from all over the world out to sea to show them all of our amazing seabirds that come to South African waters. And of course, Trevor will be one of the guides on the ship in January, along with several of the other guides who join him on the Zest for Birds trips. So now, before we get on to the workshop, I just want to remind people that you can put any questions that you have for Trevor in the Q&A box rather than in the chat feed, as it's harder to keep track of things that are in the chat. So please do put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can once Trevor's finished presenting. So that's all from me, and now over to you, Trevor.
Right. Screen here. This. There we go.
There we go. Great.
Can you see?
Yes.
All right. Perfect. Thanks, Christina. Just work out here how to stop on video. There we go. All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you. Thank you for the introduction, Christina. I think we'll just get straight into it. I'm going to be talking about the albatrosses and giant petrels this evening. And Christina's already covered this, but just a little bit about my experience. Obviously, I am involved with running pelagic trips. So I've been operating Zest for Birds for 24 years. And I did many pelagic trips before that. In fact, my first pelagic trip, I think I did in 1988. So it's been quite a few years of going to sea, and I've spent a number of days out of Cape Town. So since 2000, we've run over 500 trips and taken over 5,000 passengers out to sea. But yeah, before that, I'd also done a number of days prior to Zest for Birds actually starting. And the idea with the pelagic trips is that we take people out to the edge of the continental shelf where the trawlers operate. And that's where there's a big nutrient-rich upwelling of water at the edge of the continental shelf, and it brings lots of fish. So that's why the trawlers are operating there. And naturally, the birds just come for all the food, and it's incredible numbers of birds. And as you can see in this photo, there's lots and lots of albatrosses there. All right, so let's just talk about seabirds in general, tube noses as they're known. So both albatrosses and the giant petrels, or all the petrels, in fact, are known as tube noses, but they are taxonomically in different bird families, the albatrosses and the petrels. And the main obvious difference between them, other than size, is the actual nostrils. So on the left, you will see on that wandering albatross that its tube nostrils are split on either side of the bill, whereas on the giant petrel, the southern giant petrel, as with all petrels and shearwaters, etc., it's a singular tube on top of the bill. So they all have these tubed nostrils, and that's to assist with, I'm sure you're all aware of this, but seabirds have a salt gland above their eye, and that's what extracts the salt out of the water that they drink, the seawater, and then it pushes it down the nostril, and you'll often see a little droplet at the end of the seabird's bill, and that's the saline mixture that's been excreted out from the salt gland through these tubed nostrils. Just looking at albatrosses in general, they're divided into 4 groups across the globe, and there are 21 species worldwide. Well, I suppose it depends who you ask and which taxonomy you follow, because some people could tell you there's up to 24 species, but generally we accept that there's 21 species, and those 21 are divided into 4 main groups. You have the great albatrosses of the genus Diomedia. You've got the smaller albatrosses, which are referred to as mollymawks. You've got the sooty albatrosses, and then the Pacific albatrosses. So this evening, we're going to be dealing with the first 3. We won't deal with Pacific albatrosses because, unfortunately, we're unlikely to see any of those on flock to Marion. And they're just very rare, obviously, anywhere in the southern Indian or southern Atlantic oceans. They're mostly confined to the Pacific Ocean. So starting with the 2 most numerous groups, we have the great albatrosses and the mollymawks. And the obvious difference between these are the back. So the great albatrosses, all of them will have white backs that separate the dark upper wings, whereas the mollymawks, all of them will have the color of the wing extending across the back. You'll often hear some of the guides shout out white back when they see a great albatross in the distance. Perhaps it's not close enough for them to ID specifically at that time, but at least when you hear the call whiteback, that means that they're onto a great albatross as to one of the other smaller albatrosses or mollymawks. So that's a very obvious way to start with the albatrosses. If we look at the great albatrosses, of the ones that we are most likely to see, these are the 4. So it's the northern royal and southern royal albatrosses. So both of those breed around New Zealand. You have the wandering albatross, which actually breeds at Marion. So that's pretty much guaranteed on the trip. And then the Tristan albatross, which breeds on the Tristan archipelago in the South Atlantic Ocean. But we did have 1 or 2 on the last flock to Marion. It's an unusual record, but there is a possibility that they could turn up. So those are the 4 likely great albatrosses that we might encounter on this trip. And as a starting point, let's just look at how you decide whether it's one of the royal complex or one of the wandering complex. And that implies that you're going to get a reasonably close view of the bird. So some of the obvious differences are, on the royal complex, they always have a black cutting edge to the bill. And on the wandering on the right there, you can see there's no black cutting edge. And that, even from a distance, that can be quite obvious to see. Another useful feature is the actual tone of pink of the bill. Royal albatrosses are generally a much lighter pink, and wandering albatrosses are a richer pink, brighter, richer pink. It perhaps doesn't show up as well in this photo because the wanderer is taken in brighter light than the royal, but it is quite noticeable when you see these birds next to each other in particular. And another feature, which is perhaps a little bit more subtle, is the angle at which the beak joins the head. So in royal albatrosses, it is at a much more of an angle, whereas in wandering albatrosses, it's far more vertical, that joint between the bill and the head. It's not a feature that you're going to use terribly often in the field, but it is just a good supportive feature to help separate between these two complexes. And if we move on now to the various species, let's start with northern royal albatross. So this is a fairly straightforward bird, white back, completely jet black upper wings, and a nice broad carpal patch on the underwing. If you can see on the right-hand side there, it mentions more extensive black carpal patch. I should just note that all of these illustrations are out of Sassel, so thank you to Strake and the authors for allowing us to use these, and also Fancy Peacock for his fantastic illustrations. So just looking at some photos, this is an adult northern royal albatross, and the things that I want to point out here in particular is the jet black upper wing, but it goes all the way to the front of the wing. There's no lightening on the leading edge of the wing at all. And also that broader carpal patch on the underwing. So as it gets close to the actual carpal joint, it broadens out quite a bit. As youngsters, they also have the white backs with completely black upper wings. The bird on the left is a very young juvenile, and they have these incredible black teardrops all the way across the back. And as you can see, even in that bird, it's got a little bit of black in the tail, but the tail is still mostly white. The bird on the right is a slightly older bird, so it's lost a lot of the really big black teardrop marks on the back, but it's still got some light streaking on the back. So that's always a good way to age these birds. You can look at the markings on the back, whether it's very bold teardrop marks for a young bird, streaking for an older immature bird, or completely white back for an adult bird. Just to point out, that's what I'm referring to, obviously. And just another shot of this is an adult northern royal albatross. I wanted to just mention here, you can see that along the front edge of the wing, there's this little white line, but it's not going up onto the upper surface of the wing. It's literally just the front face of the wing that is white. And there's no problem for that in a northern royal albatross. This will make a little bit more sense when we discuss the next bird now, which is the southern royal albatross. So southern royal albatross has a white leading edge to the wing. They start off with darker upper wings as the juveniles and immatures, and they develop these white spots in the middle of the wing on the elbow joint as a starting point, and also a bit of a white leading edge to the upper wing. As they get older, the whitening starts to increase, but it increases from the front of the wing backwards. They also have a much narrower carpal patch on the underwing. So that's another useful feature to take note of. And if we look at some photos of these birds, so this is an adult southern royal albatross. You can see there's a lot of white already on the leading edge of the wing, and it's starting to move into the center of the wing. A nice white tail on the bird, and naturally also very narrow carpal joint markings on the carpal joint, that black edge on the leading edge of the underwing at the carpal joint is much narrower than on a northern royal albatross. That feature is particularly good for adult birds. It doesn't always work that well for younger birds. So this is a juvenile, excuse me, a juvenile southern royal albatross. The few features that I can point out here, on the underwing, you can see that carpal joint is a little bit broader. And if you only saw the bird like that, you might think maybe it's a northern royal. But if you get a view of the upper wing, you can see that that whitening is already starting on the leading edge of the wing. And also the whitening in the middle of the wing roughly at the elbow joint is started. So those features you wouldn't find on a northern royal albatross. That's probably the best way to tell them apart. And looking at a bird coming towards you, this is also a younger southern royal albatross, but I wanted to show it so that you could go back, think about that other northern royal that I showed earlier. This bird has got the white on the leading edge of the wing, and it's already starting to go up onto the upper surface of the wing. And that's the obvious difference when you see these birds approaching. You'll see this clear white leading edge going onto the upper surface of the wing on the southern royal albatross, whereas the upper surface of the wing on the northern royal will always be that jet black. If we move on to wandering albatross, this is the species we are, out of all of the great albatrosses, we are most likely to see. They obviously go through quite a variable set of plumages. Top left, you can see as they start as this totally dark chocolate brown bird with just a white face and white underwings. And then as they get older, they get a bit whiter on the back. It's sort of mottled, and they get white on the belly. Then eventually they lose all the color on the body. They have a completely white body, but still mostly dark upper wings and a dark tail. And then they start to whiten from the center of the wing. Another useful feature that you will often see on wandering albatross is that pink or peachy mark just behind the ear coverts. The wandering complex is the only ones of the great albatrosses that show that. The royal albatrosses won't show that at all. So looking at this is a nice adult wandering albatross. It's already got a lot of white on the upper wing, fully white tail as well. And on the underwing, you can see they've got virtually no black on the leading edge of the upper wing. So there's nothing near the carpal joint as with the royal albatrosses. They've got almost no black there at all. A younger wandering albatross is not quite a fresh juvenile. It's already starting to show some mottling on the back and some whitening on the belly. But to give you an idea of these large brown birds, look quite different to the adults. And take also a particular note of the facial feature. It's got this sort of Roman helmet type feature with a little bit of brown that comes into the cheek patch, which I'll also come back to in a little while. Just to show a few more wandering albatrosses, this is a nice, very old adult on the left, fully white upper wings virtually, and a younger adult on the right. You can see it started whitening from the center. There is some white on the inner forewing already, but there's still quite a bit of black on the tail in that bird. The problem with a lot of these great albatrosses is that you can't use a single feature. You've got to use a combination of features to be able to identify them, and that makes them incredibly difficult at times. So the last of the great albatrosses is the Tristan albatross. As I mentioned, this one is pretty unusual, and it's probably a poorish chance, but we just need to look at the features. You You can see what they say in Sassel here. Plumage similar to younger wandering albatrosses. The problem with Tristan albatross is that there are certain plumages, like these, for instance, where on a single bird alone with no context, you couldn't tell if that was a wandering or Tristan albatross, because they all have exactly the same plumages. So Tristan albatross has a slightly more delayed plumage, so they can stay in this brown plumage on the left until a lot older than wandering albatrosses do. And the other feature is that we're starting to think may be useful is the shape of the white face of these brown and white birds. You can see it's more rounded on this bird on the left. It doesn't have that Roman helmet type feature of a wandering albatross, but we're still testing that theory a little bit. So it's not an absolute feature at the moment. Just looking at a few more, the bird on the left, again, a bird on its own with no context, you would not be able to tell that bird whether it's a wandering or a Tristan, because they both come in exactly the same plumages. I can confidently say that these are all Tristan albatrosses because they were taken at the breeding island, where wandering albatross don't occur. But if you saw these birds in the middle of the ocean somewhere away from any of the breeding islands, you wouldn't necessarily be able to identify them. The bird on the right is in a plumage which we believe is unique to Tristan albatross. It's an adult male bird, and you have a combination of a mostly black upper wing with quite a bit of black still present on the leading section of the forewing, as you can see on this bird, in combination with what's been referred to as a piano key tail. So bits of black and bits of white in the tail. A wandering albatross with this much black on the upper wings would still have a fully black tail, much like the bird on the left is showing. And a wandering albatross with a piano key tail, so bits and pieces of black and white in the tail, would already have a lot more white on the upper wing. So as far as we can tell, this plumage is unique to Tristan albatross and is probably, at the moment, the only safe plumage that you can identify them in away from the breeding islands. Okay. I just thought I'd also put this in. There is a size difference. Wandering albatross is a lot larger than Tristan albatross, but that's only of use when you have other species close by to actually compare them to. So I happen to have both of these birds next to shy albatrosses. Unfortunately, as nice as I asked the shy albatross in the top photo to go and sit behind the Tristan, like it had done with the wandering, it wouldn't do that. So I couldn't get a direct comparison. But you can see that the Tristan is quite a bit smaller. It's although it is larger than the shy albatross, it's much closer in size to that, and it's much less bulky. It also has a shorter bill. And if you look at the facial features, you can see on the top bird, it's quite a nice rounded white face. And on the bottom bird, it's got this bit of a Roman helmet thing going on with this bit of brown that sneaks in towards over into the ear coverts. As I said, that's not a confirmed feature yet, but it does seem to be vaguely reliable based on testing it on a number of birds and a number of photos so far. Okay, so this is where things get confusing as well, because I've told you about those white marks on the elbow joint on the upper wing. So we have a wandering albatross on the left and we have a southern royal on the right. And as you can see, they've both got that feature. So how's that going to help? So what are we looking for? We are looking for the leading edge of the wing So you can see on the left, the wandering hasn't got a really big white leading edge to the wing, whereas on the right, the Southern Royal does. We're going to look at the tail. You can see that the wandering has got a nice, big, thick black tail, whereas the Southern Royal has got a mostly white tail. And we're going to look at that little peachy smudge around the ear coverts, which the wandering has and which the Southern Royal doesn't. So, as I mentioned, you can't concentrate on a single feature with these birds. It's got to be a combination of features, because a single feature can appear on all of the species, but it needs to appear in certain combinations so that you can be sure what species you're looking at. I think I just need to reiterate as well that these birds are certainly not easy to identify. I mean, I have many individuals that I see these days still where you get a less than perfect view, and I just can't be exactly sure which one it is. So there's often cases where certain birds have to just be left unidentified, unfortunately. Um, and if anybody tells you that these birds are easy to identify, they clearly haven't spent enough time looking at them and trying to identify them. All right, we'll move on to the smaller albatrosses, the mollymawks, and we'll start with the shy albatross. Now, shy albatross has mostly white underwings with just a thin black edge to the underwing. It has a black thumbprint at the base of the wing. The upper wings are a sort of sooty brownish gray, if you want to call it that. I'll talk about the bills and things a little bit more just now, once we get to some photos. And I think what we should also just mention is that there are two races of shy albatross, and the one that we will be seeing on the flock to Marion is the stead-eye race of shy albatross, which is also known as white-capped albatross. So the nominate race of shy, which is Kauta, that breeds around Tasmania, that's very, very rare in South Africa. And it's unlikely that we will see that one. So we're going to see the birds that breed around the Auckland Islands off New Zealand. I think the biggest population in that archipelago is actually on an island called Disappointment Island. So just looking at shy albatrosses, these are adults. I mentioned the grayish-brown back of the birds. And then we also spoke about the very thin black edge to the underwing, both the leading and the trailing edge. You can see that they're equally thick, but just quite thin all around. So from a distance, you just get this idea of this albatross with very white underwings. And then also the thumbprint at the base of the wing is another useful feature. This is a fresh juvenile shy albatross. So these birds fledge in late July and August, and then come straight to South Africa. In fact, the bulk of the young birds. So we start seeing them in our spring, or late September, October onwards, and there's a chance that we could still be seeing some fairly fresh or fairly young birds in January when we go on flock to Marion as well. So these very, very dark-headed birds, but back color remains the same and underwing detail remains the same as well throughout the ages and plumages. As they get slightly older, you can see that they start to lose the gray head. Their face starts to whiten eventually. They retain a bit of the darkness on the nape and mantle, but the underwings and upper wings all still remain the same. So just looking at the ages here, on the left we have an adult. You can see it's a sort of pale grayish hornbill with a nice yellow tip. On the right we have a young bird, not quite a juvenile and immature, but juveniles have the same kind of bill, grayish bill with a dark tip. Just another shot of a shy albatross. So this is what would probably be considered either a very young adult or a very old sub-adult. That's mostly in full adult plumage, apart from the bill tip, which hasn't fully changed to completely yellow yet. You can see that there's still a little hint of darkness left on the bill tip. Otherwise, it's pretty much fully adult. Black-browed is the next one I want to talk about quickly. So black-browed is slightly smaller than shy. It has more jet black upper wings. And on the underwings, it has a much broader leading edge to the underwing and then a thinner trailing edge to the underwing. That's on the adults. The adults also have an orange bill with a sort of reddish tip. On the younger birds, you can see that they have almost completely dark underwings. They have a gray head and they have a gray bill with a dark tip. But there's lots of variations in between that. So looking at some adults, you can see that lovely jet black upper wing, and you can see the underwing. And then this is a juvenile black-browed albatross with a nice gray head and the dusky underwings, almost completely dark. There's no real white on the underwing at all. And what the books will all tell you is that juvenile black-browed albatrosses have a brownish bill with a dark tip. The tip is always obviously darker than the rest of the bill. I'll come back to that again. As immature birds, much like the shies, they start to lose the gray on their face and the head, and the bill also starts to lighten up a bit, but they retain the darker, duskier underwings, as you can see. So just looking at the bills, we start on the left. This is the youngest of the lot. It's a sort of grayish bill with a black tip. As they get slightly older, the black tip is retained, but it starts to become more horn in color rather than gray. On the left, you now have a sub-adult bird. Its bill has changed to orange, but it's still got a darker tip. And on the right, you've got a full adult with an orange bill with the reddish tip. So that's the sort of progression of the bill coloration through the ages. Just another shot of an adult again, showing that orange bill with the red tip, and the underwings, the white center with a broad black leading edge and a narrower black trailing edge. So just looking at these two that we've just discussed, the shy and the black-browed, in the adults, the bill color is obviously different. The shy has this grayish bill with a yellow tip, and the black-browed has the orange bill with the reddish tip. And then also looking at the wing color, the shy has the more sooty brown upper wings, and black-browed has more jet black upper wings. On the undersides, the adults, shy has this very narrow edge to the underwing, narrow black edge. Black-browed has a much broader black leading edge to the underwing and a narrower black trailing edge to the underwing. So quite different in their underwing patterns. And in the young birds, the young shies have the same underwing pattern as the adults, that mostly white underwing with just a thin black edge. And the young black-broweds have these dark, dusky underwings with no obvious white visible in them. All right, we're going to move on to yellow-nosed albatrosses. And we have two species. We have Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross, which has so both yellow-nosed albatrosses have black bills with yellow ridges. They both have mostly jet black upper wings. The underwing pattern is pretty much the same as well. Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross, this one has a grayish head. And if we look at Indian yellow-nosed albatross, You can see the upper wing, underwing details are very much the same. Bill's also the same, but it has a mostly whitish head with just a faint grey wash on the cheeks. Now this can also be tricky to see depending on the light that you have, and you always need to be careful of this. So there are a few other things to look at as well. But just looking at the two, left is an Atlantic, right is an Indian. You can see this Atlantic's got a nice, obvious grey head, whereas the Indian is quite white. There's not even much grey on the cheeks on this bird, but these are both adults. So I will show an image of a juvenile shortly, but only the adults have that yellow ridge on the top of the bill. The juveniles have a totally black bill. Just looking at the underwings again, Atlantic on the left, Indian on the right. They're very similar on the underwings. And again, you can look at the head, the grey head on the Atlantic and the whiter head on the Indian. So here we have sort of close-ups of both birds, Atlantic on the left, Indian on the right. And that Atlantic doesn't look like it has a particularly dark grey head. So in sort of harsher, brighter light, or if the bird is quite worn, their heads can look extremely pale, but there are still certain features that one can use to separate these. If you look at the yellow ridge, you can see on the Atlantic at the top of the yellow ridge, it's got a rounded edge, and on the Indian, it's got a very pointed edge. So that's quite an obvious difference between them. And the other useful feature is that Atlantic always shows this black wedge in front of the eye, and Indian has got a very, very pale grey mark in front of the eye. It's not a very obvious black wedge at all. And that can often be seen from great distance. So that's a very useful feature to keep in mind. So this is a juvenile Indian yellow-nosed albatross and a juvenile Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross, which I don't have a decent photo of, unfortunately, but it would look almost exactly the same, except for that lovely black wedge in front of the eye, which the Indian doesn't really show. So that would be the main difference between the two. So it gets slightly more confusing now because we're going to talk about grey-headed albatross. Now, grey-headed albatross also has jet black upper wings. It has an underwing somewhere between yellow-nosed and black-browed. So it's got a broader leading edge and a narrower trailing edge. The confusing thing is that the young grey-headed albatrosses don't have the adult underwing like the yellow noses do. They have a dark underwing like the juvenile black-browed does. The adult also has a nice yellow ridge on the top of the bill, and it also has a yellow line at the bottom of the bill. So yellow at top and bottom of the bill, which is different to the two yellow-nosed albatrosses, which only have yellow on the ridge. So just looking at some adults, if you can get a close enough view of the bill and you can see the yellow on the top and at the bottom, then you're pretty much guaranteed that you've got a grey-headed albatross. You can see that on the underwing, the leading edge of the underwing is a lot broader than in the yellow-nosed albatrosses as well. It's much closer to black-browed, and it has quite a narrow trailing edge to the underwing. So these are adult birds, and they're fairly straightforward. Then you get the juvenile birds. So juveniles obviously also show the grey head, which can, with wear, become quite white around the face. They have the duskier underwings, and like the yellow nose, they also have no yellow showing on the bill. It's just a completely black bill. Or anyway, that's what the books will tell you, that it's a completely black bill. Here's another young grey-headed albatross, just to show the underwings again. And in this bird, you can actually see that it's starting to show some of the yellow coming through on the ridge of the bill and at the base, at the bottom of the bill as well. So moving towards a more adult-like bill coloring. So again, out of Sassel, just having a look at the 3 birds with yellow on their bill. So you have the 2 yellow noses with just just yellow on the ridge, and well, a little bit of yellow just below the gape, and on the right-hand side, the grey-headed with yellow on the ridge and at the bottom of the bill. And the shape of the yellow on the ridge is also different between all 3 species. It's broadest on the grey-head, and then the difference between the Indian and Atlantic, as I pointed out in those previous photos, with a very pointy tip on the Indian and a more rounded tip on the Atlantic yellow-nosed albatross. So if you thought it was simple, now's when things get confusing. So on the left, we have a juvenile black-browed albatross, and on the right, we have a juvenile gray-headed albatross. These guys have read the books because the juvenile black-browed has a pale bill with a dark tip, and the gray-headed has a all-black bill. So that's exactly what all the books will tell you. That's how it should be. The problem is that some birds don't read the books. So on the top, you have a young black-browed albatross with an all-black bill. And on the bottom, you have a young gray-headed albatross with a pale bill with a darker tip. So now here's where it gets really crazy. And you've got to look at the actual bill structure to decide what you're looking at. So on top, we have the skull of a black-browed, bottom of a gray-headed albatross. And I want to make I want you to take particular note of a certain area where those arrows are pointing. So on the gray-headed albatross, behind the nostril, you can see there's quite a texturous area, a membranous area called the naricorn, which the black-browed albatross doesn't have. And that's one of the features you've then got to look for. And really, the best way to do that is with decent photos to be able to see that whether it's there or not. And here this is a close-up of a juvenile gray-headed albatross. There you can see that sort of texturous area behind the nostril. That doesn't occur in black-browed albatross. So no matter what the bill coloration might be, because we've learned that although the books tell you that how it should be, and 99.9% of the birds have read the books and follow that, there's that small group of rebels that just don't want to go with the trend. And then we have to look at this little bit of membranous naricorn behind the nostril to see which of the species it is. And as you can see, if you don't get really nice, close, good views or photos of these birds, it's going to be very tough to work out what it is. All right, let's move on to the sooty albatrosses. We'll start with sooty albatross. These are really beautiful, elegant birds. Some of my favorite albatrosses. Sooty albatross is all dark brown except for the juveniles, which can sometimes create confusion. I'll show you photos of juveniles as well. The juveniles have dark bills, whereas the adult has this yellow line on the bill, and they also have these lovely white eye crescents as well. The shape of the sooty albatrosses are quite unique, very long pointed wings and long wedge-shaped tails. And even from a distance, just in silhouette, you can tell that you're seeing one of the sooty albatrosses on shape alone. So these are lovely adults, and you can see nice yellow stripe on the bill, clean brown body, long pointed wings, and that long wedge-shaped tail. The younger birds are the ones that can cause some confusion because they have these paler patches around the face and the nape. But if you look, it's very much restricted to just that area, and it doesn't actually come down onto the mantle and the back at all, that pale coloring. It's restricted just to the face and the nape areas in these young birds. And looking at light-mantled albatross, the shape is exactly the same. Overall, it's slightly paler in color. The adults have this dark face with the light mantle, which is obviously where it gets its name from. And instead of the yellow stripe on the bill like the sooty albatross has, it has a blue-gray stripe on the bill. And the youngsters are also paler over much of the body compared to the sooty albatrosses. So looking at some adults, you can see it's a paler gray almost compared to the brown of the sooty albatross, but the shape is much the same with that darker face. And the very young birds with a no bill stripe, it's an all dark bill and pale on the back and on the actual body, paler than the adults, but the overall shape is still the same. So if you compare that to the young sooty albatross, which had a white face and nape, but the back and the body was dark, so they are actually quite easy to tell apart. I think people just get confused when they see a sooty albatross showing some pale areas on the body and assume it's going to be a light mantled. Just one more shot of a light mantle. You can make out that bluish bill line on this bird. Okay, so there's often confusion now because we're talking about large brown birds or dark birds. We have the sooty albatrosses and the giant petrels. And giant petrels are very large. They're the size of a small albatross. So it's understandable that there may be confusion, but there are some very obvious differences between them. We'll start with the bills. So both sooty albatrosses have black bills, either with a yellow line or blue line, depending on the species, or no line at all if they're juveniles, whereas both giant petrels have pale bills. So that's a fairly obvious difference. Both sooty albatross species will have the white eye crescents. Both giant petrel species don't have those. And then it comes down to shape, and we look at the wings. Both sooty albatrosses have these long, narrow, and very pointed wings. Both giant petrels have proportionally shorter and broader and more rounded wings. So the shape is quite different. And similarly, the tail. Both sooty albatrosses have these very long diamond-shaped tails, and both giant petrels have these shorter, more rounded tails. So superficially, they may look different, but there are some very obvious differences that one can easily see between these two species. So if we look at the giant petrels, we'll start with northern giant petrel, and the main difference between the two giant petrel species are the color of the tip of the bill. Northern giant petrels have a reddish brown tip to the bill, and southern giant petrels have a greenish tip to the bill. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. I mean, there are some other differences where northern has the head and the body coloration more uniform, whereas southern has it. Southern's head is often paler than the rest of the body. Northern often gives a more capped appearance than southern, but those features are not always straightforward to see in the field. Just looking at some images. So we've got, this is an adult northern giant petrel. You'll notice the bird has a pale eye. So as adults, their eyes are pale. And this is a young northern giant petrel. You can see it's got a dark eye. And both The juveniles of both species start off as these chocolate brown birds with dark eyes. So all the other talk about whether the head and the body are the same color or the head is paler than the body has absolutely no value in the juveniles at all. The only thing you can use for juveniles is the color of the tip of the bill. So this again is a nice old adult northern. You can see the reddish brown tip to the bill, the pale eye, and a little bit of a capped appearance on this bird. And then to talk about southern, we've got the greenish tip to the bill, as we mentioned before. And okay, often with the adults, the head being paler than the rest of the body. So the bird on the left is an adult southern giant petrel. And you can see that it does have a little bit of a cap, but overall the head does appear a little bit paler than the rest of the body. The bird on the right is a juvenile. You can see it's all dark chocolate brown, but it has a greenish tip to the bill. So that, as I mentioned previously, those juveniles, apart from the bill tip, you can't use any other feature really. Here's another close-up of a juvenile, a nice chocolate brown bird, showing the bill tip, no reddish brown color to it at all. And an adult bird, yeah, you can see the paler head and the contrasting with the darker body. Also the more greenish tip to the bill on this bird. Another thing that I've noticed mostly on southerns, on older southerns, and not so much on northerns, is that they get a paler leading edge to the upper wing. Another shot here where it shows that quite nicely, and the paler head. Unfortunately, not every individual is as straightforward as this one. There are a few that are quite tricky, but this is a clear southern. And then southern comes in this white morph as well. It's an absolutely stunning bird. And what makes it easy is you don't even have to look at the bill tip because northern doesn't come in this morph. Only southern does. It does show the greenish tip to the bill of the southern, but yeah, that's the only species that comes in this white morph. Just another shot of this white morph southern. And that can be variable. They can have more speckling than this bird is showing, or they can be virtually completely white. They're a bit variable on the amount of markings, but always predominantly white with some brown speckles. So lastly, we're just looking at the comparison between the two. Again, we've got northern on the left and the southern on the right. We're looking at the bill tip as the main feature to separate these two. And then as add-on features, we look at the head, northern showing a more capped appearance, and the head also similar color to the rest of the body, and southern showing a paler head in contrast to a slightly darker rest of the body. And this obviously only, as I mentioned, works for adults. It doesn't work for juveniles because they're all dark brown and those features don't work at all. Okay, I think that basically covers it. And I'm not sure if everybody's confused and has absolutely no questions or has thousands of questions. I'll leave it to Christina to go there.
Thanks, Trevor. That was really great. That was yeah, you covered all the species that we're likely to see and gave great tips on how to differentiate them. You can see all the emojis flooding in that people also really loved it, and everyone I'm sure found it very useful. And so just to reassure anyone, if you missed anything that Trevor said, I will be sending out the recording to everyone probably by Monday, if not before. So you'll be able to rewatch it and pause and rewind and everything that on the recording. So there are a few questions, Trevor, so You can't get away that easily. Firstly, from Celesta, talking about the Tristans, where you had two pictures together saying one of them also had a pink neck patch. Is that usual, or is that kind of an unusual feature to see on a Tristan?
No. So Tristan is part of the wandering complex. So the wandering complex will show those peachy or pink neck patches. The royal complex won't show them. So
Okay.
both wandering and Tristan can show that feature.
Great. Thanks for that. Then there's two similar questions. Let me just try and answer them or ask them together. So Hans Eric, and then also an anonymous attendee. So Hans Eric says, hasn't the shy and white-capped albatross been recognized as separate species? They are separated in Peter Harrison's book. And then the other question was just saying the taxonomy is quite complicated. Could you clarify a bit on what you're considering relative to the complete former shy complex? I understood you said when you're talking of shy, you're considering only Thalassarchi steady and not Kauta, which would be quite rare. And what about Salvini? Yeah, so this gets quite into the details. So maybe you can just kind of
No,
give a
that's fine.
broad
I'll chat about all of that quickly.
Great.
Okay, so as let me just work out here how to start my video so you can actually see me. I am really here.
Yes.
All right, so yes, you'll find that there's loads of different treatments of the taxonomy of albatrosses. Peter's book treats it in one way. Steve Howell's book treats it in one way. Hadaram Shirahai's book will treat it in another way. So I think in terms of the way we're working with the listing here, we're following the IOC World List, International Ornithological Congress or Committee. I can't actually even remember now. Anyway, the IOC World List, and they treat nominate Kauta and Steadeye, the two races of shy albatross, as subspecies of one another. Salvin's albatross, Salvini, and Eremita, which is Chatham albatross, those are treated as separate species. So I mentioned 21 or 24. The difference of three would be the shy white-capped albatross split. It would be the Antipodean Gibson's albatross split, which are treated as one species, New Zealand albatross. And it would be the northern and southern Buller's albatross split, which are treated as one species, Buller's albatross. Listen, at the end of the day, they're different taxa, and it's good to try and see them all because you never know what might happen in the future. But at the moment, the IOC has 21 species of albatross, and that's just the taxonomy that I've chosen to follow with these presentations. It is unlikely that we're going to see nominate shy albatross on this trip, or Salvin's or Chatham Island albatross on this trip. They're all very rare. I think I've seen nominate shy twice in Southern Africa. I've seen Salvin's maybe 5 or 6 times, maybe a bit more, and I've seen Chatham twice. So and that's in 600 days specifically looking for birds. So they're not common at all. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that. It does get a bit confusing, but glad we'll have some experts on board to help resolve some of that. And just on that note, for anyone wondering or who hasn't attended the other workshops, on the vessel, the guides all get together in the evenings and chat about the different species that have been seen and work through any tricky IDs that have photos. So if you do have a camera on board and you take a photo of something you're not sure of, you can always approach one of the guides And if they're not sure, they'll take it to the collective guide meeting and try and get an answer. So then there's a question from Jonas saying, will you be setting up a joint trip report on eBird that we can join so that all the created checklists will be accumulated there? Now, are you an eBirder, Trevor?
I am an eBirder, but goodness, a joint, yeah, I mean, that's going to be a tough one to, I will have to chat to some of the other eBirders to see how, I mean, it's very easy to share checklists, but I mean, how to create a joint one, yeah.
Yeah, I'm also not sure about that.
Yeah, there's probably people that are more qualified to answer that, and I'll happily keep eBird checklists and share them with, if there's a group thing to share them with. But I mean, yeah, I don't always understand the mechanics of how to do all of that stuff.
Me neither. We will also have, I think, if it's the same as last time, an old school whiteboard, which will have a list of species every day. Oh, sorry, that's my, there we go. Sorry about that. So we will have an old school, list of species that will get updated every day by the BirdLife South Africa information desk. So then there's a question from Kevin saying, are there any albatrosses for which we're likely to see far more juveniles than adults, or vice versa? So kind of what's the split of adults and juveniles in your experience?
Yeah. Yes, there probably are. So things like shy, I guess, and black-browed, we're probably more likely to see more younger birds in January because the adults will be on their breeding grounds. Yeah, the others, which all breed at Marion, it's less of an issue because we will see the adults there. I think it's mostly shy and black-browed that we probably will still see adults, but the numbers of younger birds will be far more than the adults, just because of the time of the year.
Okay. Yeah, that's a useful bit of info to kind of store away. Might help with some IDs. Then Celeste says, I'm an avid eBirder and can help with the technical stuff. So Celeste, we can maybe touch base on the ship and see how we can sort that out. And I'm sure there's there'll be a whole lot of eBirders on board as well.
No, exactly. If there's an easy way to do a group eBird checklist instead of 2,000 people doing individual eBird checklists, I'm all for that.
Yeah. Then there's a question from Michael asking, how close do the giant petrels come to the ship? And I guess you might want to mention the albatrosses as well, how based on the previous voyage.
Yeah, it varies. You know, we had some of the birds coming so close that you couldn't fit the entire bird into the frame of the photo you were trying to take, and other times they were further away. Yeah, there's no particular pattern that they follow. I think particularly on our days closer to Marion Island, we'll have birds close to the boat, whereas our travel days are the days that they're more likely to be further away. But yeah, it's not an absolute science. You know, the birds they will come close at times.
Yeah, and particularly on the days that we're around Marion, as you mentioned.
Yes.
And I think it also depends on the wind, how close they get. I remember last trip being astonished to see an albatross kind of soaring right next to, I was on one of the very uppermost decks and was almost eye level with an albatross. So I was, that was quite a memory that's seared into my brain. So you can get amazing close-up views.
Yeah, I think one must remember that the weather, particularly the wind, is the stronger the wind, the more these seabirds love the conditions.
Mm.
So, if we happen to have a day where there's no wind and the sea is flat, calm, and it's lovely conditions for people to be out there, but it's the birds really don't enjoy that. They just sit around and don't fly much at all, because it
Mm.
expends a lot of energy. Where on a Whereas on a day where the weather is really foul and most of the birders would far prefer being inside listening to Peter Harrison talk than being outside on the deck. That's when the birds will be really nice and close and swaying up in the wind right next to the ship and things like that.
Yeah. Although I did read a paper recently that was looking at how successfully albatrosses feed based on the weather, and the higher the winds and the more stormy conditions, they find it harder to feed. So they might find it easier to fly,
Yes,
but feeding
yes,
will be tricky.
correct.
So just a quick question on sort of logistics from Ivan. Asked saying, do the guides do shifts on board, or are they out all day every day? Well, technically they do shifts, but a lot of them are out all day every day, but they might not be on duty at that time. So you'll know when a guide is on duty when they have their high-vis vest, and they'll have a radio to be able to communicate with other parts of the ship. And then they'll probably still be out there when they're off duty, but it would be great if they could just bird and not have to be officially guides, although most of them are very, very generous with their time. So just be courteous and respect their time if they're not technically on duty. But yes, I think there are something like 65 guides, so there'll be plenty out there on the decks. Um, okay. Just looking for some another question. So Hans Eric asks, how good is the black beak edge as a character to or characteristic to differentiate between species?
Black beak edge. Are we talking about the cutting edge now of a royal albatross?
I assume so. He doesn't specify that, but I assume that might be what he's referring to.
Yes. Okay. So I mean, but both royals show that, and it is quite obvious to see, even at a distance, and so that's a fairly useful feature to separate the royals from the wanderers. And then once you've got that down, you then need to decide, go through all the other features and decide if it's a northern or southern royal or wandering or a Tristan, etc. But the black cutting edge to the bill is a diagnostic feature and fairly obvious to see even from a distance.
Okay. Then there's a question from Martin saying, would it be possible to run fish oil drip from the ship? This is often done on other trips. It can be great to bring in storm petrels and then the albatrosses. So I don't know if you have an answer to that, but I can chime in as well. But I'll give you a first go.
Look, I think it may be possible to try that. It's going to be of little value when we're actually around the islands because the birds will be all around us anyway. So I don't think that's worth the effort. It's mostly going to be of maybe some use when we are traveling to and from the island. We have tried actually using chum before, big frozen chum blocks. But the problem with these large ships is that even although it's standing still effectively, and we've got the chum out behind it, the chum just breaks up and floats away, and it's not like you can quickly turn this 300-meter ship around and go after the chum block to get closer to the birds. Yeah. So the oil thing, we've had some success with it to get birds to follow the ship, but yeah, we'll just have to see whether that's going to work on this trip or not. But it'll only really be for the days that we're traveling.
Yeah, as you say, I think we tried it on the 2017 flock, and it just kind of went and was gone.
Yes.
So we are now 11 minutes past 8, but there's a couple more questions if you don't mind hanging on, and we still have a decent number of viewers who are interested. So an anonymous attendee asks, or saying if there's time, well, we'll make time, if you can speak to the Amsterdam albatross.
Okay. Are we talking about the ID of the Amsterdam albatross?
I guess so, or perhaps just a comment on where they're found and the likelihood of what we
Okay, so Amsterdam albatross is it's found on Amsterdam Island. So if you take a line from the tip of India down to Antarctica, and you take a line from South Africa across to Australia, roughly where those lines intersect, that's where Amsterdam Island is, in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So Amsterdam Island albatross is one of the rarest albatrosses in the world. I think there's around 170 individuals left now, or maybe just over 200. I'm not sure what the latest count is. It is a bird it's of the wandering complex, and but it's a bird that never gets out of that brown juvenile plumage. Even the adults are still in that brown plumage. It's a very tough bird to separate. Amsterdam albatross is probably the only now, of course, I've told you that the royal complex has a black cutting edge and the wandering doesn't, but now Amsterdam albatross is a member of the wandering complex, and it has a black cutting edge and a dark tip to the bill. But the chances of us seeing Amsterdam albatross are, goodness gracious, it's very, very low. I think we've got 2 satellite tracked birds into southern African waters and 1 site record ever. That was the 13th of July, 2013. I won't forget that date.
What a good memory.
Yes. So yes, it's a very rare bird globally. It's whatever, 170 to 200 individuals in the whole wide world. So the chances of us bumping into one are very, very low. But it looks like a young wandering albatross with a black cutting edge and a dark tip to the bill. And there's also some finer features. There's sort of white tabs on the side, and it's kind of like brown sideburns almost on the sides of the head. But yeah, I didn't think to include that because I thought the chances are extremely low of us bumping into one of those.
Yeah, but thanks for that. Still interesting information. I'll just answer to a quick sort of logistical questions. Hans asks about the lecture schedule, whether they're during the day or in the evenings, and how this will impact the first and second dinner sittings. So my colleague Hanneline Smith-Robinson is on the Zoom room, so I just asked her, and she's organizing the lecture schedule. So there's 3 lectures during the day and 1 evening lecture. There are 2 lecture rooms, and there'll be no lectures scheduled for the 2 days we're around the islands, just on the days where we're traveling. And they are at 9, 11, 2, and 7:30 in the evening. So you'll be able to fit in dinner either before or after the lecture, I think, in the evening. So don't worry about that. And yeah, there's so much food on that ship, you might not even want dinner. And then Hans Eric asks, any news on how close we can get to the islands? As far as I know, we are still waiting for news from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. So we will give you that news as soon as we hear it from the department. But as far as I know, we're still waiting to hear. So I think we'll just go do one more question from Michael saying, what kind of lens would you consider useful for the bigger birds? Is 800 mil too much?
Well, the first question is whether you're shooting on a full frame or a cropped sensor body. If you're shooting on a full frame, then no, 800 is definitely not too much. And in some cases on a cropped sensor, it might also not be too much, particularly on the traveling days, because the birds will probably be further away. On the days around the island where the birds are closer, you can probably get away with a 500 on a cropped sensor and a 600 on a full frame, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Yeah, I know lots of people are wondering about photography, so it's good to have some tips there. So I think we will leave it there. Thank you very much, Trevor, for sharing your expertise with us. And yeah, it's been very helpful. I know that I'm going to watch all these workshops again, and we'll send out the recordings so everyone can watch them again. And Hanneline's just reminded me that you are actually giving a photography lecture on the cruise. So
Yes,
yeah,
you
people
snuck that
interested.
one in. Yeah, yes, Annalena, I haven't replied to your email yet, but yes, I am aware that I'm giving a photography lecture on the cruise.
Good. Thanks for that, Trevor. But yeah, I think we'll let everyone go now. Just thanks very much again to you for sharing your knowledge, and everyone, all our viewers for listening and supporting the webinar, the workshops. So yeah, with that, I'll say good night, and we'll see you on board, Trevor, if not before.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Christina, and everyone for joining. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.